Hi, so today we're going to talk about, again, the endocrine glands. So this is part two, or the endocrine system. This is part two, and we're going to talk about the thyroid gland and the adrenal gland and their function. And the thing to kind of keep organized in your head is that these are still hypothalamic pituitary hormones. So the hypothalamus sends the signal to the pituitary sends releasing hormones to the thyroid gland and to the adrenal gland. So we're still kind of in that pituitary, I guess, framework. Okay. So these are just background slides here. I will stop at this one. So this is our hypothalamus. So we have the thyrotropin releasing hormone and corticotropin releasing hormone here. Okay. And then the thyroid stimulating hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone here. So that's what we're talking about today. Okay, so those are going to activate their individual glands that are in a different part of the body. Okay, so we'll start with the thyroid gland here, and it's located in the neck. So if you were doing that with your face and putting your face up to the sky, then this would be where the thyroid gland is. So it sits right there, kind of in front of the trachea. And kind of surrounds it there. So thyroid hormones are synthesized and secreted by epithelial cells of the thyroid glands. We're going to see this picture kind of in a couple of different, we're going to kind of zoom into it, and it's going to look more and more active. But these are the follicles that kind of make up, you can kind of see in the thyroid gland, but these are the follicles that make up the thyroid gland. And the way that these are arranged is there are epithelial cells that surround the follicle, okay? And then you have the lumen of the follicle here, which is called colloid. Okay, and we're used to thinking of colloid as being proteins, and in this case, it's true because the protein that is mainly inside that lumen of the follicle is thyroglobulin. So that's in here. The thyroglobulin we're going to see is made in these epithelial cells, and then it kind of moves out here, and that's where the thyroid hormone is made, and then it moves back in, and then it's released to the bloodstream after that. So these epithelial cells surround that follicle containing colloid, which is comprised of that thyroglobulin. So thyroid hormones have effects on nearly every organ system in the body, including roles in growth and development, increasing basal metabolic rate. So essentially, when I think of thyroid hormones, I'm thinking of increasing activity, making things happen, just mobilizing energy. So it's using energy and it's doing things. Okay, so that's kind of what happens. It's very vague, and we're going to talk about some more details of exactly what they're doing. But they increase the metabolic rate, the basal metabolic rate. So that increases glucose uptake into cells, ATP production, hydrolysis of ATP, increases your body temperature, kind of makes things move faster in your body. Just more activity. Increases lipid metabolism, fatty acid production. When we say fatty acid production, we're kind of talking about triglycerides and releasing those fatty acids so then they can be cleaved and turned into glucose and used for energy. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the thyroid hormones. So there are two active thyroid hormones. One is called thyroxine, and the other is called triiodothyronine. The difference between these is just that the thyroxine has 4 iodine molecules or atoms attached to it, and then the triiodothyronine has 3 iodines attached to it. So we call them T4 and T3, and that's much easier to say than thyroxine and triiodothyronine. So the T4 has 4 iodines, nice, and T3 has 3 iodines. So a couple of things, the T3 is actually more active than the T4. But the T4 accounts for 90% of thyroid hormone production. So 90% of the thyroid hormone that the thyroid gland makes is the T4 flavor. But the T3 is the more active variety, I guess, type. So hormone. So the target tissues then can fairly easily, it's a one enzymatic step, convert T4 into T3. So that enzyme, so the enzyme will just cleave off that one of these iodines. I don't think it's that one. Probably it's got to be this one down here. Okay, so it cleaves that off, and then you have T3. All right, so that happens in the target tissues. All right, so I also have here, note the ring structure of thyroid hormone. So if you look at this, now we've talked a little bit about things being hydrophilic, hydrophobic, or lipophilic, lipophobic, polar, nonpolar. All those are kind of interchangeable to some respect. But thyroid hormone tends to be of the nonpolar, lipophilic, and hydrophobic. Okay, so those types. So if we say that they're lipophilic, that means that they can easily, or they can, pass through a lipid bilayer. Okay? Which means that if these guys can just kind of slip through that lipid bilayer, they can move right into the cell, and they will bind to receptors right inside the cell. So they can bind to receptors either in the cytosol, or they can go all the way and just bind to receptors in the nucleus. And the reason they do that is because they're really going to have an effect on DNA expression for the most part. So they're going to be turning on genes that are going to be making other proteins which are going to do the work. So the thyroid hormone is released, and it says, make the enzymes to, I don't know, start gluconeogenesis. Okay, so then that's going to go in there, and that's going to happen. Okay. All right, so let's talk about how thyroid hormone is made. So we already talked about that follicle and the colloid, that lumen of the follicle, and then the epithelial cells around it, and then here is the blood vessels around that. So thyroid hormone is synthesized by the follicular epithelial cells that are arranged in circular follicles. So we're talking about these guys. So these blue ones here in this picture, that's where the synthesis starts to happen. Okay, but then one of the steps is to move out here, get the iodine, or actually make the thyroid hormone, and then move it back in. Okay, so this, the basal membrane up here faces the blood, and the apical membrane faces this lumen out here. So colloid in the middle is primarily composed of a protein called thyroglobulin, and thyroglobulin will have newly synthesized thyroid hormone attached to it. So when stimulated, the thyroid hormone is moved back into the follicle cells, these guys, the blue ones, and then into the bloodstream. Okay, so let's look at how that happens in a more detailed way. So this is our capillary. These are our epithelial cells here. And then, so these are epithelial cells, blood capillary, obviously, and this is the lumen, or what we're calling the colloid. So thyroglobulin is a protein, so it's TG here. So it's synthesized inside the cell. So it's a protein. So it's just gene expression, turn on the DNA, and then put the proteins together. Okay, it has a lot of tyrosine on it, and the tyrosine is what ultimately is going to, the tyrosine is ultimately what's going to turn into, or be converted into, the thyroid hormone. So it's synthesized in those follicle cells, and then it's moved to the colloid lumen. So that's the thyroglobulin. Okay, so it's now we've made it, we've moved it out here. Okay, so now the thyroglobulin is out here, along with a lot of its tyrosine. So now we need iodine. So iodine ions are transported via sodium cotransport, so we can see that here, into the follicle cells, and then they move through and they just diffuse into the lumen out here. Okay. So now we have iodine ions. They have to be they move in, and then they have to be oxidized into molecular form I2. And then after they are turned into that I2 form, then they will form what's called mono and diiodotyrosine. Okay, so here's what we're looking at here. Okay, so we have the iodines that first have to be oxidized into I2. I don't know why. I'm sure it's a very complex chemical equation, and a good reason. But then the iodine is distributed to the tyrosines, either 1, 2 here on this one, which is the diiodo, or one iodine is put on, and that's the monoiodotyrosine. Okay. Let's see, and then the next thing that happens is that these will conjugate. So like one of these will kind of go up here and stick to the one of these others. So you end up with, this is actually the tyrosine, or the thyroid hormone here. Okay, so the thyroid hormone is actually 2 tyrosines stuck together with their iodines. Okay, now this is why we're talking about all of these steps: the oxidation of the iodine to I2, the sticking of the iodine on the original, these first tyrosines, and then the leaping of the, what we're going to call DIT or MIT, onto another one. Okay, so then we have 2 of these that are joined together, and they're still stuck to this thyroglobulin protein. All of these steps that I just named are catalyzed by something called thyroid peroxidase. So thyroid peroxidase is the enzyme that creates or synthesizes or catalyzes the synthesis of thyroid hormone. Okay, why is that important? Because there is a very useful drug called propylthiouracil that blocks thyroid peroxidase function. Okay, so it kind of replaces some amino acids in there, makes it so the thyroid peroxidase doesn't work. Okay, so thereby blocks thyroid synthesis. Okay, so PTU or propylthiouracil blocks the function of the enzyme that is essentially making thyroid hormone. Okay, so it's like it's catalyzing 3 steps. You block that, it's not gonna make it. Okay, so you give somebody this medication, it reduces how much thyroid hormone they make. All right, so we've made our thyroid hormone, but it's still stuck to the thyroglobulin. So now we get a signal saying, hey, we need thyroid hormone released into the bloodstream. So this thyroglobulin with its T3 and T4 attached to it will move back into these cells. Okay, and then it will cleave off in the lysosomes, but it'll cleave off the actual hormone, and then that hormone is by itself released into the blood, and the thyroglobulin that was there will then be kind of recycled. Okay. All right, so after formation of the T3 and T4 on the thyroglobulin, activation, so thyroid releasing hormone was sent down, will cause the complex to move into the cell where it is cleaved and then secreted as that active thyroid hormone. And the MIT and the DIT will be recycled, and that thyroglobulin will be recycled, and then the process starts over again. All right, so that's how you make thyroid hormone. And if you have the signal to do it, you will just make more and more and more and more of it. All right, so this is just another I guess, perspective to kind of look at. It's like a check to make sure that you understand it. It's a little bit more simplified, but yeah, it's the same things: the sodium and the ions, or the iodine, moving in, peroxidase, and then let's see, formation of the I2. So this oxidation reaction here. And then the MIT-DIT ionization of those, and then the conjugation to make the enzyme, all catalyzed by that enzyme, and then move it back in, cleave these off, and release them. So, and then recycle. All right. So thyroid hormone transport in the blood. So we've released it, we've gotten the signal, now the thyroid hormone is going to go out to all the organs and it's going to do its thing. So most T3 and T4 hormone is transported in the blood, bound to something called thyroxine binding globulin. Okay, so it's a protein, it's a globular protein. And that's what the T3 and the T4 stick to mostly. A small amount may be bound to albumin or something called prealbumin. And an even smaller amount is is unbound and free floating. So here I am, I'm saying that most of it is bound to this thyroxine binding globulin, and a very, very tiny amount is unbound and free floating, but I have this in bold type. And that's because, in even bolder type in purple, only free unbound T3 and T4 is active. So what does that mean? That means that the stuff that's bound to this thyroxine binding globulin, the TBG, only a small amount of that, or that's not released. That's not going to go into cells and activate these cells. It's only the unbound stuff, which means that as it's moving through, this T3 and T4 is kind of falling off. Okay, so a little bit of it falls off, and then it'll join back on, bind again, and then it falls off again. So you've always got a little bit kind of floating around of the T3 and the T4. So most of it, yeah, is stuck here on the thyroxine binding globulin, but a little bit is falling off, and that's fine. That's just the way it works. So, but that means that the protein-bound form must dissociate before diffusing into cells. So it does. And so it's floating around, it moves into cells, and then it's activated. So because TBG, and fix that. So because TBG, which increases levels of free T3 and T4. Okay, wait, let me see. So because TBG is made in the liver, okay, so it's made in the liver. Albumin is also made in the liver. So these proteins are made in the liver. Liver failure can reduce how much TBG is there, which means that it's not there to hold on to the thyroid hormone, which means that you're going to have an increase of free thyroid T3 and T4. Okay, so if you don't have the thing holding it, you're going to have more floating around. So the consequence of that is that you will turn down production of, so this is going to go up, it's going to tell the hypothalamus, it's going to tell the, pituitary that there's a whole lot of thyroid hormone floating around. So it's going to reduce that signal until the thyroid gland, the thyroid gland isn't going to make as much. Okay, so it's going to reduce how much the thyroid gland is making. So it actually reduces synthesis. All right, so, and then I mentioned earlier that T4 is converted to T3 in target cells by the enzyme, and it's called 5' iodinase. And that I have a note here, this enzyme is inhibited during starvation. Okay, so remember T4 is less active. So this conversion from T3, or from T4 to T3 is done by this enzyme, 5' iodinase. And that's going to increase that activity. And so you're going to have, if you're increasing thyroid activity, you have an increase in metabolic rate. You're turning things up. You're using resources. You're making glucose. You're burning glucose. All right. So this enzyme, this is kind of a handy process, is inhibited during starvation. So if you're starving, you don't want a high metabolism. So if you reduce this enzyme, then you have the less active form. You have more of the T4, which is going to reduce your basal metabolic rate. It's going to slow things down, so you're not burning as much energy. Okay? It also means you're not maybe making proteins as much, and you're not building things up that need to be done, but at least you're conserving energy. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting about this, the brain form of 5' iodinase, that enzyme, is it's different, and so it is not turned down during starvation. So the idea is that if you are deficient of nutrients, that you're going to slow your metabolic rate in your body, but your brain is not going to be as affected. So your brain will still be able to process and think and do whatever a brain does. All right, so it's kind of an interesting little feature. All right, so regulation of thyroid hormone secretion, it's really through primarily through the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary kind of sniffs around and sees how much thyroid hormone is in there. And if there is enough thyroid hormone around, it will stop the release of thyroid. Oh shoot, I think I said that backwards earlier. thyroid stimulating hormone. I think I said thyroid releasing hormone earlier. Whoops, sorry, ignore that. So, so yeah, thyroid releasing hormone is a tripeptide released, synthesized and released by cells of the hypothalamus. Okay, so that's thyroid releasing hormone. And then to stimulate the actual thyroid gland is thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, and then if there is enough T4 and T3, it will reduce the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. All right. Let's see. So yeah, and so if there isn't, then you have more release of it. Okay. Okay, so let's see. TSH causes growth of the thyroid gland, so thyroid stimulating hormone released from the pituitary. That will cause the thyroid gland to secrete more thyroid hormone, but remember those follicles, the colloid we were talking about, it will cause growth of that. If you have more stimulation, then you're going to have, your thyroid gland can get bigger. Okay, so the reason we mention that is because goiter is an overgrowth of the thyroid gland. It will start to protrude out, and you'll have this giant mass potentially on your neck because you're trying to make more and more and more thyroid hormone. Okay, and we'll talk about how that can happen. So the presence of free T3 mediates the negative feedback. So it's T3. So T3 and T4 both go back to the pituitary, but it's really the T3 that has the effect, and that's because it has that iodinase enzyme that converts the T4 to T3. Okay, so that's fine. That's fine. So so it's T3 and T4 in the blood, but really when it gets to the pituitary, it breaks it down into T3, and the T3 is what reduces or shows the pituitary how much. That's the one the pituitary is reactive to. It's the T3. All right. Can't believe I got my TRH and TSH mixed up. It's easy to do. Cautionary tale. All right, so actions of thyroid hormones. So T4 is converted to the more active T3 by the 5' iodinase. So we have moved out of the thyroid gland, and now we're at the cell. Okay, so the T3 and the T4 arrive. T4 is converted to T3, and then that will bind a receptor, okay, in the nucleus. Okay? So we're talking about nuclear receptors now. So a nuclear receptor, remember the cell has its nucleus, and in the nucleus is the DNA. Okay, remember that? And so we're talking about in here in the nucleus, that's where the receptor is. So the thyroid hormone is just moving right through, right into the nucleus and binding to the receptor. All right, so DNA is transcribed to mRNA, so it's telling, so it binds this receptor, and then that will activate the DNA of whatever cell this is, and will tell it to start making proteins. Okay, so it'll say, all right, so transcribe DNA, which means make an mRNA copy, and then translate that mRNA to make a protein. So put amino acids together. This is all DNA does. Okay, so it's pretty easy. If you're activating DNA, you're going to be making a protein because that's all your DNA does, make proteins. So you're going to synthesize new proteins that have these effects. Whatever cells they're found in. So growth, bone maturation. So bone cells, nervous system, maturation of the central nervous system. That's an important purpose of thyroid hormone. And I'll tell you, a lot of what we know about what thyroid hormone does is we know what happens when we don't have it. So if there's a thyroid disease that a child has where they don't make thyroid hormone, then they will not have normal maturation of their central nervous system. So we know this. The basal metabolic rate, sodium potassium pumps, O2 consumption, because you're going to be burning, you're going to be making more ATP, and you use oxygen for that, oxygen and glucose. Burning things inside your body, even though it's not a fire, it does increase heat because it is energy. production, just like burning a marshmallow. It's just that it's doing it enzymatically, but it still produces some heat. So that's going to turn your body temperature up. Metabolism, other metabolic processes, glucose absorption, glycogenolysis. So you're going to break down glycogen to release a lot more glucose. You're going to make more glucose. You're going to break down lipids. You're going to make more proteins. Cardiovascular, you're going to increase cardiac output. And this other thing, I have this mentioned somewhere else too, but upregulation of beta-1 adrenergic receptors, which are found in the heart, which is going to make the heart beat harder, and so blood pressure can be affected by this. All right, so let's talk about all of these again. So basal metabolic rate, metabolism, increased oxygen consumption, and again, that's because we are taking glucose and we're burning it in oxygen. And I say burning, but you know, it's essentially burning it. It's just not fire, to make ATP. Okay. All right, so of course we're going to need oxygen for that. Let's see. So increased glucose absorption, mobilization. You're going to need more glucose for that. Increase ATP production. Okay, so that's what we have in our little picture here. That uses the oxygen and glucose, and then increase sodium, potassium, ATP, ACE activity. So if we have the ATP, then we're going to burn ATP, A to ADP, and inorganic phosphorus. So that's ATP ACE production. So now we're just burning things. So we're getting our sugar, we're burning our sugar to make ATP, and then we're hydrolyzing our ATP to make energy. Okay. So increased protein synthesis, including key metabolic enzymes and protein degradation. So you have overall, so let's think about what I just said. So you're increasing protein synthesis, and you're also to make, and you make enzymes, that's a big thing that proteins do. They're also structural proteins, but then you also have protein degradation. Okay, so these things are both happening, and the thyroid gland will cause that to happen. So when you have, and this is one of those things we know because we can measure it, if you have increased thyroid hormone, okay, so hyperthyroidism, then what we see is that this increased protein production and degradation is a futile cycle. It's not really doing anything productive. It's increasing our oxygen consumption, so there's more burning of things, ATP, and ultimately, if it continues, then you will actually have a decrease in muscle mass. So it's mobilizing that energy, but ultimately, what is seen is a decrease in muscle mass. Okay, so increased lipid metabolism, so more fatty acids are out there for energy. Increased basal metabolic rate leads to higher body temperature and heat intolerance. Okay, so we've mentioned that a couple of times. Cardiovascular and respiratory effects, increased ventilation, so you're breathing harder, deeper, faster, and increased cardiac output, and we mentioned that by the induction of the beta-1 adrenergic receptor upregulation. So we just increase the number of receptors, okay? And then if you have more receptors, you're going to have more activity. So the effects on growth, thyroid hormones work synergistically with growth hormones and somatomedins, so the workhorses of the growth hormones that the growth hormones activate. Those are the somatomedins, to promote bone formation. Okay, so increased bone density and length during development. So central nervous system and autonomic activity. So thyroid hormones interact with the sympathetic nervous system. They're responsible for normal maturation of the central nervous system. And then we also talked about the increase in receptors that we see here of the beta adrenergic receptors. And so beta blockers, the LOL drugs, may be effective in treating some symptoms of hyperthyroidism. Okay, so if someone has hyperthyroidism and cardiac effects, then you can give beta blockers, if everything else warrants it, and that can reduce. Give them metoprolol, carvedilol, labetalol. All right. So physiology of thyroid hormone, hyperthyroidism. is overstimulation of the thyroid. Okay? So if we have hyperthyroidism, we're also going to have hypothyroidism. So if we have, so overstimulation of the thyroid, so that's kind of a generic term. So what kinds of hyperthyroidism can we have, or where can that come from? It can either come directly from the thyroid gland itself. Okay, so the thyroid gland itself is overactive, or it could be from the hypothalamus or the pituitary. Okay, so there could be, a pituitary tumor that is sending out more thyroid stimulating hormone to stimulate the thyroid gland, which is going to cause more activity. Or it could come from the hypothalamus or the thyroid gland itself. So Graves' disease is the most common form of hyperthyroidism, and it is interesting because it is an autoimmune disease. So if we have our thyroid gland, this is going to be a ridiculous picture. So we have our thyroid gland, and on our thyroid gland, we have receptors. Okay? So we have these receptors here for thyroid hormone. Okay? So specifically, it's for thyroid stimulating hormone that's coming from the pituitary. Okay? So thyroid stimulating hormone will come down here and bind to those. Now, what happens in Graves' disease is that it's autoimmune, so the body starts producing antibodies against these thyroid stimulating hormones. But instead of killing them, which is usually what antibodies do, it activates them and it increases function. So we have this continued, because we're making all of these antibodies, we have increased activity of the thyroid gland, and so the thyroid gland can get big and produce a lot of thyroid hormone. Okay, so that's what's going on with Graves' disease. Graves. So that's the most common form of hyperthyroidism. It's autoimmune, type 2 hypersensitivity. That just means that it's very specific to the protein or whatever that it's attacking. In this case, it's attacking, quote unquote, the thyroid the TSH receptor, but instead of destroying it, it's activating it. So thyroid immunoglobulins, that's just antibodies, are antibody proteins made by the immune system. Antibodies usually attack and cause destruction of their target antigen, such as a virus. So they kill viruses and bacteria, proteins on bacteria. But in this case, they're targeting the TSH receptor on the thyroid gland and increasing the activity. All right, so some symptoms of hyperthyroidism that are seen: weight loss with increased appetite, hair loss, arrhythmias, so cardiac problems, rhythm problems, breathlessness on exertion, bone loss, heat intolerance. So that one makes sense. We know that it's increasing basal metabolic rate because you're increasing heat temperature. So that means if you're in a warm environment, it's going to be hard to cool down. So you're going to be intolerant to heat. Sleep disturbances, goiter due to overstimulation of the thyroid gland, sweating, tremor, nervousness, weakness, exophthalmos. Okay, so that's what we see here. This woman is not surprised. This is an increase in connective tissue behind and around the eyeballs that's pushing them out. So this is from excess thyroid hormone that's actually pushing these forward and causing that I guess look. Okay, with the eyeballs kind of bulging out. All right, so I have over here in red, if the cause of hyperthyroidism originates from the hypothalamus or pituitary, then TSH levels will be increased. So this is kind of an important concept to really understand. Okay, so if we break this down, if the cause of hyperthyroidism originates from the hypothalamus or the pituitary, then your TSH levels will increase. So that makes sense. We're okay with that, right? So here's your pituitary up here, your pituitary gland. Okay, it looks something like that. And it's releasing TSH. Now you have a tumor or something on it, it's going to be releasing more TSH. Okay, so that means you're going to have higher TSH levels. But what if like in Graves' disease, where the hypothalamus isn't really involved, there's no tumor up there, you just have the thyroid gland being activated normally, and it's making all of this thyroid, it's your thyroid hormones, it's making all this thyroid hormone, like too much of it. Well, that's going to go back up here, and it's going to tell the pituitary, it's going to say, hey pituitary, look how much thyroid hormone we're making down there in the body, and the pituitary is going to say, oh no, that's too much, and it's going to slow TSH production. Okay, so there's not going to be much TSH, or there's going to be none. It's just going to shut down TSH because that's too much. Too much hormone is out there. So you can kind of see that your TSH levels, and if Graves' disease, and you have to understand this, if Graves' disease is, one of the most common form of hyperthyroidism, and TSH levels are kind of measured in lab tests. So one of the things that could indicate, if you say, hey, I think this patient, maybe they have a thyroid problem, and then you look at the TSH levels and the TSH levels are 0, then you're going to be like, okay, and kind of, it seems illogical, but it's perfectly logical. That means that they have too much thyroid gland, or too much thyroid hormone. Okay. All right. So, yeah, makes sense. All right, so pathophysiology, okay, so hypothyroidism. So we're moving from hyper to hypo. So obviously this is going to be decreased metabolism. Okay, so let's look at some of the causes of this. So thyroiditis, that's an autoimmune, again, autoimmune, but this time it's doing what we expect, which is destroying the thyroid gland. It's not better, but yeah. So thyroiditis, destruction of the thyroid gland. Hashimoto thyroiditis is the most common of those. Now, some other things, thyroidectomy. If you cut the all or part of the thyroid gland out, so maybe there was a tumor on the thyroid gland. So you cut it out, then you can live without your thyroid gland. You just have to take supplemental thyroid hormone. Okay, let's see, and then hypothalamic or pituitary failure, iodine deficiency, or some others. So if you don't have enough iodine, then you're not going to be able to make thyroid hormone. Because thyroid hormone it's fundamental to the synthesis of thyroid hormone. And then, of course, if your hypothalamus or pituitary aren't working, then you're not going to have thyroid hormone being made enough. All right, so symptoms are roughly the opposite of hyperthyroidism. Some of them are exactly the same, but this is what we see. So obviously a decreased metabolic rate, weight gain, so you're not burning as much energy, so that's from that lower metabolic rate. Again, hair loss, goiter. So we haven't talked a lot about goiter, but if you recall, goiter was part of hyperthyroidism too. So if we have an overactive thyroid gland, okay, depending on where it's coming from, then you can have goiter, so it's going to grow. Okay, so now we see it with hypothyroidism. You may be saying, well, how does that work? If you have less thyroid hormone being made, why do you have goiter? Well, let's say, for instance, that you don't have enough iodine. Okay, so your iodine is supposed to make the thyroid hormone, so you have very little T3 and T4. Okay. So it's telling the pituitary, say, hey, there's hardly any. The pituitary is like, haven't seen any T3 or T4 for a while. Of course, it's looking at T3, but whatever. So it's going to start saying, hey, TSH, let's make more. Okay. And the thyroid gland is saying, well, I would, but there's not enough iodine. But that stimulation will say, well, we need to start making more of the thyroglobulin, start bringing stuff in, and so it does increase the synthesis of the thyroglobulin. So that's why we needed to kind of learn how this process worked, because if you don't have iodine, you're still going to make the thyroglobulin. It's just all going to be sitting in those follicles waiting for iodine. And there's no iodine coming. So it just keeps getting bigger and bigger because the pituitary is saying, hey, make more and more and more. And so you have this giant thyroid gland that can't do anything just because it doesn't have iodine. Okay, so hopefully you can see how either one of these can cause goiter. It just depends on where the effect is. Okay, so let's just kind of read through the rest, and then we'll kind of read through this, the causes. All right, so let's see, cold intolerance. So remember, if you have a lower metabolic rate, then your body isn't producing as much heat, so it's harder to warm itself. So you're not going to tolerate cold at all. You're always going to need a sweater. A lot of people, as their thyroid gland kind of reduces in function, find that to be true, that they can't, it's harder for them to stay warm. Reduced heart rate, so high cholesterol is another thing that you know, you're kind of storing more, you have more buildup of fats, you're not burning them, and then fatigue and slowed mental activity. Okay, all right, so I have this little box over here. It's the same as the other one, except it's going to have a different outcome. So if the cause of hypothyroidism originates from the hypothalamus or pituitary, then your TSH levels will be decreased. Remember, with hyper, they were increased. And as we just kind of mentioned with the low iodine, so if you have low iodine, then, so if your hypothyroidism originates in the thyroid gland itself, the thyroid gland isn't working right, isn't making enough, then your TSH levels will be high due to the negative feedback. Okay, so we can, so yeah, if we have low thyroid hormone but increased TSH, then you know that's kind of a clue there. All right, let's see. So yeah, we see that sometimes. I mean, somebody has very, very high TSH levels, and you're thinking, oh, look at that, their thyroid gland's just pumping away. But it's because the thyroid gland is not responding to the TSH, okay, which is why it's high. So hopefully that, again, makes sense. All right, so causes of goiter, Graves' disease if TSH levels are low due to antibody stimulation of the TSH receptors. We've kind of already been through this, so I don't want to really go through it again. TSH secreting tumor, that's going to cause overactivation and goiter, so it's uncommon, but the TSH levels obviously would be high if the tumor is secreting them. Autoimmune thyroiditis, so that's what we just kind of mentioned about with Hashimoto. TSH levels are high due to low thyroid hormone levels from antibody destruction. Iodine deficiency, we mentioned that. TSH levels are high because there is ineffective production of thyroid hormones. Okay. All right. Yeah. And then I kind of explained what I just went through. Goiter is caused by a buildup of thyroglobulin in the colloid lumen because high TSH is stimulating growth, but the lack of iodine prevents the production of active thyroid hormones. So you just have a buildup of the thyroglobulin. Okay, so this is kind of an overview of hyper and hypothyroidism, and it mentions the TSH levels and everything that most of what we just kind of went through. All right, let's talk about the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. So we talked about the adrenal medulla before, and the adrenal medulla is what releases the catecholamines, norepinephrine, and primarily epinephrine. Okay, so we've talked about these as being, the catecholamines as being hormones, and that's what, you know, those are released from the medulla, and we kind of discussed that earlier when we talked about neuro, and we talked about dopamine being released for prolactin, to prevent prolactin release. All right, so now let's talk about, so let's see, the adrenal medulla, we'll just quickly read through this. Inner zone of the adrenal gland, approximately 20% of tissue, neural origin, and secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. So now we're going to focus on the adrenal cortex. That's what we're here for today. So that's the outer zone. It has 3 distinct layers. So it secretes something called mineral corticoids. So when you see mineral corticoids, think sodium, potassium. So those are minerals. And then glucocorticoids. So when we see glucocorticoids, think things like glucose, or just think of glucose. And then androgens. And so androgens are DHEA and androstenedione. I'm not going to write it. So androstenedione. All right. So that's what's being released there. Or these are the hormones, but the reason you think mineral corticoids is because it's going to have an effect on sodium and potassium. This is going to have an effect on glucose. However, androgens, those include the DHEA and androstenediones. So let's talk about steroids in general. Okay? Because the adrenal gland is going to secrete steroids. Okay? So remember, the thyroid gland was an amine. Okay, so that was in the amine group. It was made from tyrosine. Okay, these guys are made from cholesterol. Okay, so this first image up here is cholesterol. That's your basic starting material. And so in the adrenal gland, a few of these things we're familiar with. So progesterone, cortisol we're going to talk about today. Progesterone we'll talk about later. Aldosterone, we've discussed that. Remember, that's in the kidney, or that has its effect on the kidney, increases sodium potassium pumps, so you can reabsorb more sodium. So we talked about the RAA system, renin angiotensin aldosterone system. Corticosterone is another type of cortisol. Okay, so it's a glucocorticoid. So these are both glucocorticoids here. And aldosterone is a mineral corticoid. And then we have down here DHEA and androstenedione, and those are androgens, okay, which cause like hair production and growth. All right, so let's see. So the precursor for all adrenal corticosteroids is cholesterol. Okay, so it's primarily supplied by the circulation. So our LDLs, so remember our LDLs carry down the cholesterol to cells that need them. So our adrenal gland does need the cholesterol dropped off. So enzymes are uniquely present in each layer of the gland. So remember, it had the 3 layers, the inner 2, and then the outer, to produce the specific hormones for that layer. Okay. The very first, so I'm saying a lot of things I'm going to have to say again, but the very first step is an enzyme called cholesterol desmolase, and that's common to all of them. But let's kind of look at how this production takes place. So this, the pictures that I just showed you showed the images and how they're similar to cholesterol. But if we look at how they're made, this can kind of get complicated. But let's kind of look at it before we just say, oh my gosh, that's impossible and overwhelming. We'll look at it first and then we'll say that. So cholesterol here, that's our starting material. Okay, and then we just mentioned this enzyme, cholesterol desmolase. That is activated by adrenocorticotropic hormone. Important to remember this. Okay, so ACTH is the stimulator of these things, okay, of aldosterone, cortisol, and the androgens. Okay, so these are your primary players, the ones that are in colored boxes here. So adrenocorticotropic hormone is turning that stuff on, production of that stuff on. So if you want to make, and this is usually what we think about, which is why I'm mentioning it, if you want to make cortisol, adrenocorticotropic hormone is the stimulator of cortisol production. Okay. Now, the thing that it does is it starts this first step. Okay. Now, and then we can kind of look at the other enzymes that are involved, and we can say, all right, well, 17-alpha hydroxylase seems to be important, and that's from this to this. And then we have this other one, 17-hydroxypregnenolone. So we've got these very complex, long hormone or enzymes that are just causing things to happen. So now we have an androgen that was made. So our cholesterol kind of moved over here, made this androgen, or it can move down this way. There's progesterone, and it can go over there and make that androgen. Okay? Or we can have this system down here, okay, which has, you know, a couple of different enzymes there, and then we have the aldosterone. All right. So two things to look at. So we kind of look at how these are kind of interrelated. We have kind of backdoor ways of making something. I mean, if you can't make, if your 17 alpha hydroxylase isn't working, then that's going to kind of shut down everything because you're not going to be able to make the cortisol. Okay, so if 17 alpha hydroxylase is gone, you can't make cortisol. But over here, there's an arrow pointing to it. Here's another glucocorticoid that can serve the same functions as cortisol. Okay, so you can make it because there's kind of this backup system to do it. All right. So a couple of little things like that we're gonna mention. But otherwise, let's kind of scope out a little bit. And let's look at what we have here. So in this lane are our mineralocorticoids, okay, except this corticosterone here, okay, which is actually a glucocorticoid, okay, just to make things confusing, because it's always fun. It's never good if things are just simple. I mean, okay, all right. I wish they were, but you have these three lanes. You've got the mineralocorticoids, aldosterone, and then you've got the glucocorticoids, which is cortisol, and you have the androgens, which is your DHEA and your androstenedione. So all the layers contain the cholesterol desmolase because that's the first step for production of everything. It's also the rate limiting step. So get that done, and then the rest of these things can just fall into place if the enzymes are there. So cholesterol desmolase is stimulated by the adrenal corticotropic hormone, so the ACTH, from the anterior pituitary. Angiotensin 2, I have down here, blocks, so the RAA system. Angiotensin 2 will block aldosterone production down here. Okay, so this is just because it's on the graph, I'm not going to worry too much about it, but there is a control feature of angiotensin 2, and it blocks that last step, so it will prevent aldosterone production. Ultimately, kind of shuts it down. All right, let's see, and then, yeah, so 21, yeah. All right, so testosterone and estrogens are made from androstenedione, but that primarily occurs in the gonads. So here we have in the adrenal gland the presence of these hormones, 1720 lyase, which is going to make the DHEA and the androstenedione. We don't make testosterone and 17-beta. We don't make estrogens exclusively in the so we don't make testosterone, we don't make estrogen in the adrenal gland. Okay, so that's done in the gonads. All right, so, and we'll talk about that later. So this is kind of the end. These are it's just showing what this can go on to produce, and we're going to come back to that when we talk about reproduction. Okay. So the glucocorticoids, we'll go through them one at a time, glucocorticoids, then mineral, and then androgens. So glucocorticoids are called glucocorticoids because they're associated with an increase in blood glucose, right? So cortisol is the major glucocorticoid produced in humans. It's produced in those inner layers. So remember we had the cortex here, and then we had three other layers, 1, 2, 3. It's produced in these inner layers. So corticosterone, that's the other one we kind of pointed to, and we said that it is a glucocorticoid. It's that backup for cortisol. If part of the cortisol pathway is blocked, that 17-beta hydroxylase, then function can continue through an alternate corticosteroid pathway. Okay, so we do have a backup for cortisol. So 11-beta hydroxylase is needed to synthesize both cortisol and corticosterone. So if we go back and we look, sorry, I'm going to go back. Let's see. So this is 11-beta hydroxylase, 11-beta hydroxylase here, 11 beta hydroxylase. All right, so 11 beta is needed to synthesize both cortisol and corticosterone. Yeah. So if a drug, if you needed to block cortisol and corticosterone glucocorticoid production, you needed to turn that down, then there is a way to do it. So you just block that enzyme and it'll block both of these. So you have no glucocorticoid production or decreased, whatever. Okay, so medication that inhibits both pathways is metyropone, and does it. Ketoconazole inhibits many of the steps along the way, but it also inhibits fungal organisms, which is why it's used as an antifungal. All right. So release and regulation of cortisol and androgen secretion. So this is going to, feedback now of cortisol. When cortisol is made, then it feeds back and turns down the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Okay, so hypothalamus releases cortisol releasing hormone. Right? Cortisol releasing hormone. Remember, releasing hormones, despite my errors. Releasing hormone is from the hypothalamus, and then usually stimulating hormone, but in this case it's adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary releases the ACTH, and then that goes to the adrenal cortex. So remember what the ACTH does. It stimulates adrenal cell growth and activity, and it initiates that process, the processing of cholesterol. It starts that first step, okay, for everything. So ACTH stimulates cytochrome P450 proteins, so it's going to cause so cytochrome P450 proteins are involved in the template to make other for these enzymatic processes. So, and other enzymes for cortisol, androgen, and even aldosterone processing. So it makes all of the stuff that's needed to make these hormones. All right, so negative feedback by cortisol directs to both the hypothalamus and to the pituitary. All right, so how does it work? So this is interesting. So ACTH has a pulsatile and diurnal secretion pattern. What does that mean? Well, that means pulsatile is that probably every couple of hours, a little more. I mean, it kind of varies, it looks like, from this graph. But there are an average of 10 secretory bursts in a 24-hour period. So you have the secretion of ACTH from the anterior pituitary, and then it goes down. And then you have another burst, and then it goes down. And then look what happens over here. So you go to bed, and it's like, we're going to bed. So we're not going to have a lot of cortisol. Now, if we remember, cortisol is a stress hormone. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about cortisol. That's our stress hormone. And then it's not just for stress, but it is activated by stress. We'll talk about what it does more. But you can see that it kind of decreases right after sleep, and so it's going to kind of, it's going to kind of increase building up of things too. It's releasing glucose, it's energizing, it's mobilizing kind of energy. So that kind of stops actually after you go to sleep, but then right before you wake up, it increases. So now we're kind of have this burst of energy, more glucose, more mobilization of the energy. So that's turned down at night, makes sense, and then it's turned up. It's turned up in the morning. Okay, so the early morning rise in cortisol levels occurs just before waking. The morning burst actually accounts for half of the whole day, the daily cortisol secretion. So cortisol tests are scheduled for early morning for this reason, and that's why it's so important to know this, is that during this time we start to see the increases in cortisol. So if somebody isn't making cortisol, if they're making too much, it's going to be really highlighted here. Okay. All right. Okay, so increased secretion is associated with stressful events or threats. So the actions of the glucocorticoids, so cortisol. So stimulation of gluconeogenesis increases protein catabolism in muscle, decreases new protein synthesis to provide more amino acids to the liver for glucose synthesis. So we're really increasing glucose. Okay, so that's what this category is, but this is how it's doing it. It's really doing it. Increases lipolysis, so they can make glucose. Decreases glucose utilization by tissues, so you have more available for other purposes. So glucocorticoids are also anti-inflammatory, so they can reduce inflammation. This is a lot of times why we give steroids. We give steroids to reduce inflammation, it reduces prostaglandins. All right, so suppression of immune response suppresses T cell proliferation. Okay, so this sounds like a bad thing, and it generally is a bad thing. So this is one of the reasons that chronic stress, can reduce your ability to fight off diseases, because it kind of takes the energy from making immune cells. Is kind of a simplified way to say it, but you're expending energy on other things rather than immune cell production. Okay, so yeah, if you're stressed all the time, you're going to have a suppression of T cell proliferation. Well, we kind of use that as an immunosuppressant for things like arthritis, organ rejection. Now, T cells tend to, bind to receptors on cells. Okay, so T cells, as opposed to B cells, which make antibodies. T cells actually are good at figuring out if there's a virus hiding in a cell and then killing it. So what happens is if you have a lot of T cells around, then those T cells are going to possibly, if you have a transplant, are going to recognize these guys and say, you're going to go. You're not supposed to be in the body. So if you find a way to suppress T cell proliferation, then that gives the transplant kind of a fighting chance. Okay, so the immune system isn't going to be so actively trying to kill those cells. Okay, so that's why a lot of times glucocorticoids are used, or steroids, as we say, are used to reduce that for organ rejection. All right, so synergistic response with catecholamines to vasoconstrict and increase blood pressure. So you do have an increase in blood pressure. Inhibits bone formation, and increases REM sleep, and increases slow wave sleep, and increases awake time. So we saw the effects. So right after going to sleep, you have low production of cortisol. So, increased REM sleep, increased slow wave sleep. But then it also is going to be high in the morning, and it's part of that circadian rhythm, which is going to wake you up. So if you have high cortisol all the time, then you may have a hard time sleeping. All right, so actions of adrenal androgens. So let's talk about those. Those are also released from those inner two layers. So the adrenal cortex produces androgenic compounds, dihydroepiandrosterone. So DHEA is one of those, and androstenedione is the other. So in males, when these are released from the or made in the adrenal gland, they're not going to play a big role, because in males, these are also made in the testes. Okay? And in the testes, synthesis is much greater, so this doesn't play as important of a role. However, in females, these are the major androgens, and they are responsible for development of pubic and axillary hair and libido. And if the levels are too high, then you have increased levels that lead to this masculinization of females. Okay, so mineral corticoids. Mineral corticoids affect minerals. So sodium, potassium, and aldosterone is our major one. So that is the major mineral corticoid in humans, and like with glucocorticoids, there is an alternate mineral corticoid that may be synthesized if part of the aldosterone pathway is blocked. We just didn't talk about it as much as we did with the corticosterone. All right. So they're only synthesized in the outer zone. All right. So regulation of aldosterone secretion. So ACTH stimulates that first step in the aldosterone synthesis. So do you remember that? Do you remember that ACTH went down and it activated that cholesterol desmolase enzyme, which was the 1, 2, 3, 4. This is our cholesterol. It did that first step, and then those all went to different areas. Okay, but that first step is stimulated by ACTH. And it's always kind of continuously taking place. And it's got that pulsatile activity all day long. So that means that aldosterone kind of also has a diurnal pattern. Okay? So, more in the morning, less in the evening, with lowest levels at midnight and higher levels in the wee hours of the morning. However, important not to forget this. So what this is saying is that ACTH has an effect on aldosterone production, but the major effect of aldosterone production synthesis is the RAA system, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So remember, renin released from the kidney, and then you have angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2, and then aldosterone. So that's that is going to be, so renin is actually going to be the primary regulator of aldosterone secretion. It's not ACTH. ACTH only has an effect on that first step. Okay. All right, so increases in serum potassium will also directly increase aldosterone secretion. So those are the two, well, there are three things. ACTH does have an effect on that first step. Renin has an effect. And then if your serum potassium levels are high, okay, so if a patient comes in with, or somebody, you have very, very high potassium levels, then yeah, increasing aldosterone activity is going to cause secretion, input or production of the sodium-potassium pumps. Okay, and so you're going to have more sodium into the urine, or I'm sorry, more potassium into the urine, and reabsorption of more sodium. So that's what aldosterone is doing. All right, so high potassium causes depolarization and an influx of cholesterol desmolase enzyme to the outer zone, which is where aldosterone is being made. And that's going to cause the synthesis of more of these sodium-potassium pump, which is going to increase potassium secretion, and also it's going to lower sodium reabsorption. All right, so actions of mineralocorticoids, insertion of sodium, potassium ATPase increases potassium secretion, increases sodium reabsorption, all those things we talked about. Increased activity of hydrogen ATPase. Okay, so hydrogen increases hydrogen secretion. Okay, so what is that going to do to blood pH? If we get rid of hydrogen, it's going to make it more alkaline, which means it's going to increase pH. Okay. If we're reabsorbing more sodium, that means we're also going to be reabsorbing more water, which is going to increase fluid volume, which is going to increase blood pressure. Right? Remember that? Okay, so so factors affecting ACTH secretion, regulation of ACTH secretion may be related to glucocorticoids, so cortisol. Okay, so cortisol feedback to the pituitary and to the hypothalamus. But then we have a whole lot of things. So androgens can also have an effect. Mineralocorticoids can have an effect. But if you look at what's going on up here in the hypothalamus, there are a lot of things that are going to stimulate ACTH. So corticotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which is going to trigger ACTH production. So let's look at some of the things that can stimulate secretion of ultimately ACTH. And yeah, so stress can increase cortisol. See, we talk about cortisol. It's kind of having an effect on all of these things. Of course, aldosterone is really kind of mostly controlled by the RAA system, so the kidney. But no, usually we're talking about cortisol, but also androgens. So stress, infection, pain, hypoglycemia. So if your blood glucose is low, yeah, you're going to increase cortisol. Sleep, hemorrhage, trauma. So stressful events, just there's psychological stress, and then there's physical stress. So physical stress includes infection, pain, trauma, hemorrhage. Those are all physiological stressors as opposed to mental stressors. We just tend to associate stress with mental. All right, let's see. So yeah, so we can read through those. So regulation of ACTH secretion may be related to glucocorticoids, cortisol, androgens, and mineralocorticoids. All right, so pathophysiology of the adrenal cortex. So again, just like with thyroid hormones, it's either going to be an excess or a deficiency of adrenocorticotropic hormones or adrenocortical hormones. Too much or not enough. So if you think about the affected hormones, you consider the affected hormones, which hormones are affected, to predict the signs and symptoms. So if we know what the hormones are doing, because there are several, right? Because there's cortisol, there's aldosterone, there's the androgens. So if we think about what they're doing, then we can say, well, if our adrenal gland is overactive, then it's going to be doing more of that. So if cortisol is increasing glucose levels, then if you have overactivation of the adrenal cortex, then you're going to have hyperglycemia, too much glucose. If you have a deficiency, you're going to have hypoglycemia. Now, I know that patients who don't have blood sugar problems, when they start taking steroids, will suddenly have hyperglycemia. And, they'll be essentially diabetic, maybe taking insulin. All right, so aldosterone causes potassium secretion and sodium reabsorption. So if there's an excess, then you're going to have not enough potassium, hypokalemia, and there are symptoms associated with that. Increased sodium reabsorption and volume expansion. So you're going to have reabsorption of sodium, which is going to cause increased blood pressure. Okay, so sodium has a way of, when it increases initially, you just start saving more water, and you have higher fluid volume, blood volume, and higher blood pressure. So deficiency is going to be the opposite. Hyperkalemia, associated symptoms with that, because you're keeping the potassium in, and decreased sodium reabsorption and volume contraction, so lower blood pressure. So the androgens, what effect is that going to have? If you have overactivation of the adrenal cortex, if it's an excess, you're going to have masculinization in females, and if you don't have enough, you're going to have a loss of pubic hair. So you can also think about the causes of it. So if the cause is at the adrenal gland, which is what we would call primary, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about adrenal hormones. So the primary area, if it's caused there, or maybe it's caused from the hypothalamus or pituitary. Okay, so that would be secondary. So which one's causing it, and how will that have an effect? Enzyme deficiencies may overlap, and so that's going to be actually in the all of those enzymes that we looked at. There are deficits of those that can also cause some symptoms, and we're not going to talk too much about. Mainly, what we're going to talk about now are the two big ones: Addison's disease and Cushing. Okay, so Addison disease is a primary adrenocortical insufficiency. So primary means that it is actually the adrenal gland that's not producing usually cortisol, but everything. So commonly autoimmune destruction of all zones of the adrenal gland. So yeah, it's going to affect them all. So decreasing circulating levels of cortisol, aldosterone, and adrenal androgens. So yep, if we're hitting them all, then you're going to have low cortisol. That's going to be hypoglycemia, anorexia, weight loss, nausea and vomiting, weakness. This is what we see. If it's low aldosterone, then you're going to have what we were looking at earlier, hyperkalemia, because you're not going to get rid of that potassium, metabolic acidosis, because you're not secreting that hydrogen. Remember, that's the other function of aldosterone. and then hypotension because you're not reabsorbing the sodium. Okay. So yeah, it's kind of interesting how we can kind of predict a lot of these symptoms, and then we can kind of look at the symptoms and say, okay, well maybe maybe this is an adrenal problem. So low adrenal androgens, so low DHEA and androstenedione results in decreased pubic hair and axillary hair and decreased libido. So if you see all of these things together, maybe it's the adrenal gland. So then the question, are ACTH levels high or low? What is the source of the deficiency? Again, that kind of comes back to, well, what's causing it? If it's at the source, if it's primary, then and you're not producing enough, then you're probably going to have high ACTH levels. So let's think about that. If you have high ACTH levels and so you're kind of turning up that production, well, so melanocytes, let's see. So one thing that we haven't really talked about, and this is kind of the only place we're going to talk about it, is there's something called melanocyte stimulating hormone. So melanocytes they produce melanin, increase pigmentation of the body. So if you have, if your adrenal gland is not functioning, so in Addison's disease, and that's primary, it's attacking it's destroying the adrenal gland, your immune system is. Well, the pituitary and the hypothalamus don't know that. They just know that there isn't enough circulating cortisol. And so it's going to increase that CRH and ACTH production. Well, one thing that CRH and ACTH can do is can increase the melanocyte stimulating hormone. Okay, so that means, why am I saying this? That means that one of the kind of, I guess, unexpected, but really if you know how it works, it's kind of expected, symptoms is hyperpigmentation. Okay, so we've already gone through all of the things and tied it to low cortisol, low aldosterone, low androgens. But here we have hyperpigmentation. Well, where does that come from? That actually comes from increased production of melanocyte stimulating hormone. Okay, because your ACTH levels are high. See, I told you it's important to kind of understand how that feedback can work. So the ACTH levels would be low if the problem was due to secondary deficits. So if the hypothalamus or the pituitary weren't functioning, weren't releasing these things right, then everything would be low. Okay. All right, Cushing syndrome. Cushing syndrome caused by excess production of glucocorticoids, so overproduction of cortisol by the adrenal cortex. So really anything that's increasing glucocorticoids. Okay. So if it's the adrenal cortex that is overproducing them, then yeah, you're going to have Cushing syndrome. If you are giving a patient bucket loads of exogenous medication, glucocorticoids, if you're giving them a lot of steroids, corticosteroids, then that's going to cause Cushing syndrome. Same symptoms. If it's a tumor, pituitary tumor, it's going to cause Cushing syndrome. If it's from a pituitary tumor, we actually give that the name of Cushing disease. Okay, but Cushing syndrome is a set of these symptoms. Okay, so symptoms most related to excess cortisol and excess adrenal androgens. That's because, so it's mostly cortisol and the androgens, not aldosterone, and we know why, because aldosterone is actually activated by the pituitary, or I'm sorry, by the kidney, by the renin, angiotensin, the RAA system. Okay. So, let's talk about Cushing syndrome and a pituitary tumor. Okay, so if we have a pituitary tumor and we are causing the activation of the adrenal gland, then yeah, you're going to see increased cortisol and increased androgens, but you won't necessarily see increased aldosterone. A little bit maybe, because it activates that first step. cholesterol processing, but it's primarily you're going to really have an increase in cortisol and androgens. So let's look at the symptoms, some that we expect, some that we just observe of Cushing syndrome. So excess cortisol will cause hyperglycemia, increased proteolysis, muscle wasting, increased lipolysis, then extremities. Just kind of listed them all off here. Some of them you can trace back pretty easily, not all of them. But central obesity, a rounded face, some people call it moon face, supraclavicular fat, so fat up above the clavicles, and something called buffalo hump, poor wound healing, decreases wound healing, which can also just come from hyperglycemia, osteoporosis, striae, which are kind of like stretch marks, but they're caused by a loss of connective tissue. So cortisol increases sympathetic activity to cause blood pressure increases, so you remember that. All right. So the androgen effects, so excess adrenal androgens, virilization, so development of male sex characteristics such as muscle and body hair and deep voice, also may cause menstrual disorders. Okay, and there's some aldosterone contributions. So like I said, mainly aldosterone is controlled by the kidney, the RAA system, but that it could also contribute to the increased blood pressure. And let's see, so this is it. So this is an image that I use a lot to kind of show, so physically some of the different symptoms. You can't see increased blood glucose, but in Cushing's, but it's there. All right. Yeah, so you can just kind of look at this, and that's all I have for this chapter part.